For nothing is hidden, but it will be made clear, nothing secret, but it will be known and brought to light. If someone were to write a saint biography about you, and they were to dig into, I suppose these days, your browser history, or back in the day, speaking to family members and friends and all that sort of thing, and if they were to dig up the various skeletons in your closet, if you have any, or if they were to look for the skeletons in your closet, if they were to ask exes, if they were to speak to neighbors, what would they find? What would they find? I think like sanctity is lived in the small things, and sanctity is lived in hiddenness. And for that reason, it's often unknown or unseen. As in, it's not like the saints necessarily have people flooding and flocking to them all the time. It can actually be difficult to live with a saint, possibly. Sometimes if a person is really saintly in certain ways, it can actually be quite difficult. So today's saint, Padre Pio, he is world-renowned, a very, very famous, relatively modern saint who only died in 1968. So for some of you that's within living memory. So again, famous the world over, and yet never went on mission abroad. And even from the beginning, Pietrelcina, the little town he was from, it's a beautiful part of Italy to visit. Just see, we're from a very lush part of the country here, where we have fields and grass all year round, and we don't need irrigation systems because the Lord provides on a regular basis rain from heaven. So we don't need irrigation systems. Jeepers, if you ever go to where Padre Pietrelcina around there is dry, it's rocky, it's unforgiving terrain, there's no such thing as a 13-acre flat field grass. It's little holdings of little bits of, you can grow olive trees and that sort of thing there. But my goodness, it's not easy. It was a tough life. Those who worked there had to put in an awful lot of effort for very little return. And so Padre Pio, when he was born, was called Francesco. So little Francesco had to work tending sheep, and at that, tending not a big flock of sheep, a handful of sheep, and that's what the family lived from. The things were very, very simple. There's a number of beautiful things about Padre Pio's life, but I want to mention just one little detail, which probably isn't, for me, is important. We'll see what you think. So little Francesco is serving Mass on a regular basis, and going to Mass on a regular basis, obviously, and praying with his family and all of that. Just a good, faithful, simple family. They were hard-working, God-fearing people. And at a very young age, about the age of about 5, little Francesco says that he would like to dedicate his life to God. He was always a bit sickly, always a bit kind of physically a kind of a weak child. So he often had bouts of illness, and in his youth, between that and between his need to stay home and farm or shepherd, he missed an awful lot of school. So at the age of 10, he decided he wanted to be a Franciscan, a Capuchin. And he went for the interview with the Capuchins, and they said, he can possibly enter, but he needs more education, because you need to be, back then, of course, Mass was still celebrated in Latin, so you have to be able to read at least Latin, preferably understand it as well, and basic theology, philosophy. You're going to need some education. Now, he had missed an awful lot of school, so in order to catch up, his family decided to pay for a tutor for him. And this is just one little detail of the story of the saint before he became a saint at all. His dad, in order to pay for Francesco's tuition, went off to America to work. Now, even in our own day, going off to America to work to pay for your family to do anything is, it's fair going, well done. We can fly, it's handy enough, it's relatively comfortable. We complain about the the 6-hour flight, but really we do get over it in time. But back then, like the cost of flight meant that if you went abroad, you did not come back often. So his father leaves the family in order to help his 10-year-old. Like, I mean, 10-year-olds. Like, one day their hero is Captain America, the next day their hero is Thor, the next day their hero is Batman, the next day they don't like superheroes, they're so over them. So you're doing this, you're leaving the family, going to work abroad in order to send money home for what could be the whim of a 10-year-old. But he does it. Pays for the tuition, and then Padre Pio, little Francesco, is able to enter the Capuchins and study. I just think that's a beautiful little detail of his story, because you see, saints aren't born ex nihilo; they're not born out of nothing. Like that, this little seed of faith was planted in a beautiful, loving, wholesome, self-sacrificial family, and out of that, this just like what a tender little vocation was born out of it. So he enters the Capuchins, and his health wasn't great. There's a story told of it's a Chinese kind of a proverby type thing. It's called "Good luck, bad luck, who knows?" And I won't tell the whole story, but it kind of applies here. Because he was so sickly, when the First World War came around, he was drafted into service. But because he was so ill, they kept sending him home, because he'd be too weak to stand or too weak to do anything. So go home. When you're better, come back. So then they'd call him back after 3 or 4 months, and he'd be, okay, go on, you can go home again. They'd send him off home again. And so then finally, after only about 1 year of military service, they said, look, just stay home. You're grand, okay, stay home, best of luck to you. He was a friar at the time, so imagine just, the atmosphere, not only of death and danger, but even just the conversation and all of that amongst soldiers, not exactly pleasant. So he was allowed back into the monastery, and all was relatively well. So even as a priest, then he was ordained in 1910. Even as a priest, he had to go home on occasion because of his bad health. So you look at this story, and it all just looked a bit kind of pathetic from the outside, Genie, your father was abroad and pays for this education, then you become a friar and a priest, and look at it. Look at the state here. It's all a bit useless, really. But you see how God sees things, and what God can do with apparently, exteriorly, so little. A sickly friar in the middle of nowhere in Italy. Italy's wonderful, but it's a fairly remote part of Italy. It's not exactly a big metropolis there, And sure, what good could possibly come from Nazareth, right? So, lo and behold, during confession, on one particular occasion, in 1916, if I remember correctly, he felt, 1916, he felt during this confession a great pain in his hands and in his feet and in his side, and then these wounds formed, and he started to bleed. So he got gloves, and he just covered up his hands, and he thought he got stung or something, but they were quite symmetrical. And then he brought this issue to his superiors, and they got a doctor in, and they noticed that the wounds were perfectly round. And even though they had been there for days and weeks and then months, they never got infected. People began to hear about this, and then crowds started to come for prayer, for advice, in part out of curiosity as well. So this wasn't something that he ever chose. In fact, if anything, he was quite shy. He was quite timid by nature. He didn't like the whole fandom of the whole thing. It's that wasn't him. He's just a povero prete di campagna, as they say, a small rural priest. So The crowd started to grow, and then internationally people started to come to him. And then soldiers started to pray for his intercession. And even when the Second World War came around, then even American soldiers heard about him, and they prayed to his intercession to come home safely and so on. Crowds started to gather. Then the Vatican, seeing all this, like, they were wondering, is this guy, is he, sorry to say it, but like, is he wounding himself? Is he trying to be famous? Is he trying to be a mystic? Because like the stigmata, this is not a common occurrence. So you have to be just very, very careful. Is he excessively, is he normal? Is he okay? Or is he actually hurting himself in an effort to be known or famous or draw attention to himself? So numerous studies were done to see how the wounds were formed. Or was he actually cutting himself? Were there lines of blades? Sorry to go into the details, but was there any evidence that he was doing it to himself? And there wasn't. Not only that, but numerous people would experience the scent of roses from the wounds. Then people praying, asking him for advice or asking him to pray for things. He had a great knowledge of people's souls. It's interesting because he would often tell people off in confession, but only for the good of their soul. Again, for priests, I would never recommend we do this. He could do it, firstly, because he's dealing with Italians, and they have thicker skin than Irish. You tell someone in Ireland, get out with that confessional until you've done a proper examination of conscience. You'll never see them again in Ireland. Whereas the Italians go, all right. And then they come back. Just don't try it in Ireland. Don't try it. But Italians would. So they come back and then say, hey, yeah, okay, I left out this little sin, little peccatuccio that I never actually said, that I actually tried to kill my mother-in-law. He said, hey, that's attempted murder, my friend. That's a mortal sin, okay? So, he could do it because he knew his people. He could also do it because he loved them, and maybe most importantly, he could do it because he had already suffered and prayed for these people. So him getting angry wasn't him just losing control or on a whim. Like, he had suffered and prayed for these people. He cared for them. He cared for their eternal salvation. So he was able to do this kind of thing without being rude. Very interesting, because he was interviewed by a journalist who came to speak to him in the monastery where he was. And so Padre Pio said, well, we facciamo due passi, we'll go for a little walk. The journalist said, sure, no problem at all. So they were walking along the courtyard inside. And then Padre Pio, we always cover his hands. And just very humble, never spoke about himself, but it was just, the journalist was asking him various questions. And so then they sat on the wall, and Padre Pio reached behind the wall and picked up a bottle of beer, right? And the journalist was like, he drinks beer, right? Pagan. Okay? And then Padre Pio said to him, would you like a drink? And he said, sure. Kind of rude to say no, so he takes a little drink of it, and it was not only warm, it was hot and flat, because Padre Pio would take one drink a day for weeks out of the same bottle that he left behind the wall. That's considered penance, by the way. If you're a beer drinker, there's no danger to your sanctity taking one drink out of a warm bottle of beer a day. But just people, like what I'm saying is, like, behind this kind of sanctity, there's also normality. Just real, but he loved his people. He suffered for them. He suffered greatly for them. He suffered also at the lack of understanding of, the Vatican. They were skeptical of his mystical qualities or virtues. So on numerous occasions, he was not allowed to preach in public. For years, he wasn't allowed to preach. I think it's 8 years, if I remember correctly. Was it? 8, I think. He wasn't allowed to preach in public. So he'd celebrate his daily mass with no homily, just the bare mass. So, and he suffered greatly because, what did he do? He didn't do anything wrong. Just trying to be faithful to what the Lord gave him. When we think of Padre Pio, I think people do like the stories. They like the the mystical stories, the levitations, the bilocations, which seems to have occurred as well on different occasions, Padre Pio being in different places. His knowledge of the soul as well was quite beautiful. In 1947, a certain Karol Wojtyła came to visit him, and he said to him, "You will reach the highest office in the church." And later he went on to become St. John Paul II. So he knew, he could read souls. He knew people's hearts. He loved them, and he cared for them, and he suffered for them. So when we think of Padre Pio, rather than just thinking of the as I say, the mystical or supernatural things, what would he say to you if you were here? Would he say, check out the stigmata? No. He wouldn't make it about him at all. So I think it's important that when we think of the lives of the saints, like, what would they want for us now? What would they say to me now? Two of Padre Pio's most famous expressions were pray, hope, and don't worry. Pray, hope, and don't worry. Pray, hope, and don't worry. On other occasions, a group of seminarians came to speak to him. And they said, Padre Pio, what advice would you give us as priests? What would you say to us as priests? And he said, amate la Madonna e fatela amare. Love Our Lady and make her loved by others. Love Our Lady and make her loved by others. You see just the simplicity of what he says. It's just bring everything back to Jesus. Bring everything back to him. He would prepare for hours before his Mass. Mass often was at 6 o'clock in the morning. He'd be in the chapel from 3 o'clock praying, Mass at 6, then hear confessions from after Mass till lunch. Very, very light lunch, like a slice of bread sort of thing, glass of water. Off he'd go again, hearing confessions. I think he'd men's confessions and women's confessions, one in the morning, one in the evening, for all the various men's confessions in the morning, women's in the afternoon, or vice versa, it doesn't really matter, but they were separated. And here for hours and hours and hours. And then his various prayers as well. Prayers in the evening on his own, then into bed for 11 or 12 o'clock, up again at 3, every day. Every day. Because he loved his people. So let's listen to the words of Padre Pio. Let's listen to the heart of Padre Pio. Let's follow the example of Padre Pio. We're not necessarily mystics, but that's not really what the Lord is calling us to. He's calling us to sanctity. To sanctity. And the sanctity is lived in the silence. The sanctity is lived in here. Sanctity is lived in the privacy of our own room. If there were to be a journalist fly on the wall, taking notes of what we do when we've got time to ourselves, how much time do we give to others, how much time do we spend praying, it's not what people see, it's all the other stuff. That's where sanctity is lived. I think in the depths of our own heart, if we ask a saint like Padre Pio, what do you want to say to me today? What's your advice to me today? I think if we sit with that question, each one of us individually and personally, and take note of what you understand in your heart, I think we can allow the saints to speak to us. I think we can still learn so much from them, so that we can become the saints that God is calling us to be today. The holy men, the holy women, the holy priests, the holy religious, the holy students, the holy teachers, the holy secretaries, the holy musicians, whatever sphere we work in, to become a saint there. And that sanctity is lived in the hiddenness. And as the Lord says, for nothing is hidden, but it will be made clear. Nothing secret, but it will be known and brought to light. So take care how you hear. So may the Lord bless us and inspire us in this journey of sanctity. Amen.